nobody could vote because they would put up all kind of hindrances.
This courthouse does not belong to Sheriff Clark. This courthouse belongs to the people of Dallas County.
You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse.
If you were white, you were right. If you were black, you get back.
I don't think we went too far arresting them. We didn't beat them. We didn't hurt them.
I became a freedom fighter that day.
I would rather die on the highways of Alabama than make a butchery of my conscience. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
My heart was beating faster and faster because I knew something was going to happen.
I am so scared. I mean, because the violence was in the air.
But I remember most of the screams.
Coming down on the heads of women and children and splitting them like watermelons.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I thought I was going to die.
And we shall overcome.
Now we have this possibility of the right to participate in the political process.
There's always been an organized attempt to turn the clock back.
Selma have changed not just America, but the world.
Selma, Alabama was like so many towns in the racially segregated South. But for a few months in 1965, it became the epicenter for a movement that forced the nation to look at itself, its prejudices, racial divides, inequalities, and its brutality. In so many ways, Selma was the perfect place for a march to remember.
Color was considered to be the badge of how you would be treated. If you were white, you were right. If you were black, you get back.
I, as a child, saw, even from my own house, the fear that my parents had.
It's hard to describe because it was the norm for me. I didn't know anything else.
Feeling the disrespect that they had to face every day.
And our parents sort of kept us sheltered from the bad stuff. If we needed shoes, they'd measure our feet with string and then go downtown and bring us back the shoes. You didn't always like what they brought back, but you had shoes.
I used to see the for colored signs only, the for white signs only, and I used to ask questions about it. And many times my parents didn't even want to respond to my questions.
As far as economic conditioning, we had outdoor bathrooms, and we were very poor. Life was a struggle.
And I wanted to sit at that lunch counter, but my grandmother said I couldn't because I was colored. And one day my grandmother was talking to one of her friends in front of the store, and she noticed me looking in the window, and she leaned over and she said, "When we get our freedom, you can do that too." And she pointed at the counter. I became a freedom fighter that day.
Before 1965, in Selma and Dallas County, less than 2% of blacks, only 240, could vote. In neighboring Lowndes County, where the black population was 5,000, not one was registered to vote.
And then you wait in line to go in to see the person who was doing the registering. And sometimes you will wait in line for several hours. And if you got in to see the registrar, they might tell you that you're the last person to come in and you only had a few minutes because the registrar had to go home.
Then you go back to work and you find out you're fired.
And in a strange sense, in a strange way, Selma selected herself.
Georgia Congressman John Lewis was among the early organizers with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC. The group joined voter registration efforts already underway in Selma. Standing in the way of blacks who wanted to register to vote was Dallas County Sheriff Jim Clark, who bullied and beat demonstrators on the courthouse steps.
He's carrying out the orders of the white community to keep minorities, blacks, from becoming registered.
This man was very cruel. He was vicious. He wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side, and he carried an electric cat powder in his hand. He didn't use it on cows. He wore a button on his left lapel that said never.
This courthouse does not belong to Sheriff Clark. This courthouse belongs to the people of Dallas County, and these are the people of Dallas County, and they have come to register.
The marches to the courthouse continued. Adults and children were arrested and jailed. 40 years later, while he was living in a nursing home, former Sheriff Jim Clark was asked about the arrest.
A lot of times we had to do what we had to do. You talk about school kids, for instance. I don't think we went too far arresting them. We didn't beat them. We didn't hurt them.
After having gone through many difficulties prior to that time, SNCC was in here, we decided that we would invite Dr. King. And so I signed the official invitation inviting Dr. King and the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come here to Selma.
Andrew Young, former Atlanta mayor and UN ambassador, was a close advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were coming off 2 hectic years.
I have a dream.
With the 1963 March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and now voter rights, and Selma became their focus.
Fireworks started almost immediately. We went to try to check in a hotel, and while they were trying to check in the hotel, this guy came up and tapped Martin on the shoulder, and nobody paid any attention to him. He said, "Bam!" And Martin, he hit him pretty hard, and he rubbed his head. He said, "No," he said, "don't bother him." He said, "You have a problem with me, sir? Can I help you?" And everybody wanted to tear him to pieces. He said, "No, please, let's hear what he has to say."
When Dr. King came and when Dr. King spoke, it just put fire in your bones. It's something about Dr. King that no man ever spoke like Dr. King. No man could motivate you like Dr. King could.
The Selma meetings and protests led to thousands of arrests, including Dr. King and Chuck Fager.
And the trustee brought one plate of greens for Dr. King, and nobody in the room, either he and Abernathy always fasted first couple of days they were in jail, and I didn't know that, so I wasn't planning to, so I got to eat it.
While sitting in a Selma jail cell, Dr. King wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times that read, "This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls."
He knew that every day could be his last, and so he couldn't let up.
When Lyndon Johnson was elected president in a November 1964 landslide, one of the people he called to thank was Martin Luther King.
Then we've got to come up with the qualification of voters. That will answer 70% of your problems. That's right.
But the voters' rights movement was about to take a turn that would be even more shocking and would push the president and Congress to act.
James was the one that Dr. King was seeing to go to these places and, I guess, case the place out, see what it's about, find churches where they can have mass meetings.
Marion Easley's older brother, James Orange, had been sent to Marion, a small town 30 miles north of Selma.
They say he had too much power, too much control over the young people. Then they say that the people that was with him were too young. So they put him in jail. He was arrested. It was an older guy that they let out of jail. He heard them say that they was gonna lynch him. To throw them off, they start marching that night.
Police attacked and beat the marchers. 24-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson sought refuge with his mother and grandfather inside a cafe.
And Jimmy had gotten shot, and numerous of people had been beaten and what have you. And so we began trying to get people to the hospitals and what have you.
And then he gets all infected inside, and suddenly he dies, and then you're mad.
The idea of going to Montgomery was born.
Without his death, the movement wouldn't have gotten very far off the ground.
And with that march to Montgomery came Bloody Sunday. A nation is shocked when Selma, a march to remember, continues. Tensions grew quickly after shooting victim Jimmy Lee Jackson died at a Selma hospital. Voting rights advocates wanted to march to Montgomery with Jackson's body. The shooting by an Alabama state trooper had lit a fuse and was about to carry images of racial injustice to a stunned America and beyond.
Those of us who led the march then were able to encourage others to follow.
As a church, we line up in twos, walking quietly, orderly, peaceful, no one saying a word. And when we got ready to cross over the bridge, Jose Williams, who was leading the march with me, looked at me and said, "John, can you swim?" Saw all of this water down in the Alabama River. I said, "No, what about you?" He said, "Yes, a little." I said, "Well, Jose, there's too much water down there. We're not going to jump. We're going straight ahead."
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
We were asked to turn around, and the leaders at the front of the line refused. And after they refused, racism unleashed its brutality upon us.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, pushing and shoving us, and then trampling us with horses. They released tear gas.
But I remember most of the screams. People were screaming and screaming, and people were just laying everywhere like they were dead, bleeding and not moving, and you couldn't stop to help them.
People had begun to be beaten down with billy clubs. Dogs and horses had begun to push their way into the crowd. Tear gas had begun to burst in the air. People had begun to try to run for their lives.
We had turned the house next to Brown Chapel into a clinic, and the people who were bleeding or who need stitches or had been seriously hurt were sort of laid out over there.
And I do recall being back at the church, and someone asked me to say something, and I stood up and said, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote."
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made a national appeal, calling for ministers nationwide to come to Selma.
There may be some tear gas ahead.
Yeah.
I say to you this afternoon that I would rather down the highways of Alabama than make a butchery of my conscience.
Yes,
On Tuesday, March 9th, a much larger group leaves Brown Chapel Church with both blacks and whites marching side by side back toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
You are ordered to stop, stand where you are. This march will not continue.
The thing that was not scripted, the thing that was not part of the deal, was when the troopers all stepped back.
There was an understanding that in order to get a federal judge to give us permission to march, we had to show respect for his court, which we did.
And we shall overcome.
2 days later, Judge Frank Johnson rules the protesters could march from Selma. The 54-mile march begins Sunday, March 21st, 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday.
Hold on.
We were not faced with policemen. It was almost as if the question of having freedom had been won. That question had been answered.
On day 5, an estimated 25,000 people filled the streets of Montgomery, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers a message of freedom on the steps of the state capitol.
Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Because of the act that you have passed that I will sign today.
The 1965 Voting Rights Act placed extra restrictions on southern states. They had to get pre-approval from the U.S. Department of Justice for any changes in local voting rules or districts. Those who marched at Selma have experienced the benefits of their bold actions a half-century ago.
We're much closer to redeeming the soul of America and creating a more perfect union.